All right, so today we're going to break down an essay titled The Evil Jews, written by someone who goes by the appellation Gorilla. Now, we need to be crystal clear from the jump. The stuff in this essay is deeply offensive, and it's built on harmful conspiracy theories. So look, we are not here to validate these views. Not at all. What we are going to do is pull apart how an argument like this gets built, because understanding the mechanics of propaganda like this is an absolutely critical tool for seeing it for what it is and shutting it down.
So the author kicks things off with these really inflammatory claims and then immediately follows up with, "But I do not hate the Jews." It's a classic tactic, right? You create this false sense of being reasonable right before you dive into some pretty extreme viewpoints. This opening is basically setting the stage for all the core arguments that are about to follow.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for this breakdown. We'll start with the author's opening statement. Then we'll dive into the central idea of a nation versus an economic zone. After that, we'll unpack a concept he calls virtue and cultural defense, look at his take on globalism and education, and finally, we'll see what he means by a return to the local.
All right, part one. Let's look at the specific beliefs the author lays out right at the top as the foundation for his entire essay.
So right off the bat, the author puts a bunch of classic anti-Semitic tropes on the table. He alleges that Jewish people are overrepresented in key sectors like government and banking. That's a common conspiracy theory. He also engages in Holocaust denial by calling its history up for debate. Then he gets into specific political stances on AIPAC and Israel, and of course uses that familiar defense, "I don't hate Jewish people," and even mentions having a Jewish mentor.
Now we're getting to the absolute core of the essay. The author frames his whole argument around a single and, you could say, pretty misleading binary choice.
And there it is. By presenting this as a simple either-or question, the author creates a problem that, surprise, surprise, his own ideology will later claim to solve. This framing is absolutely key to his entire argument.
It's really crucial to see how he defines these terms to fit his argument. He paints a nation as this kind of romanticized, pure community that's focused on legacy and future generations. And in stark contrast, an economic zone is portrayed as this rootless, soulless place driven only by profit and GDP. You can see he's setting up a very clear good versus evil story here.
Now, to support this whole idea, he presents this really distorted and simplistic timeline of financial history. He uses that age-old anti-Semitic trope that Jewish people took over finance simply because Christians were banned from usury, or lending money with interest. This is a deliberate oversimplification of some really complex economic history, all to build this narrative of Jewish financial domination.
And then he strategically uses this biblical quote. He's trying to give his argument some moral weight to connect the very idea of finance with evil and the decay of society.
So the author's whole argument builds to this one claim, that a society focused on just economics becomes weak, it decays, birth rates fall, and it becomes vulnerable to what he calls groups with a head start in lending. It's a pretty thinly veiled reference. So that's the problem he's laid out. This leads us to his proposed solution, a concept he calls a cultural defense mechanism, or virtue. The author actually borrows this term from Machiavelli, but he kind of redefines it to fit his own narrative. In his view, virtue isn't about personal morality or being a good person. Nope, for him, it's a catch-all for civic duty. It's all about preserving the group for the people who come after you.
And he uses this proverb to really illustrate his idea of virtue. It's this concept of making sacrifices for a future that you personally will not get to see.
So, according to his logic, a society with strong virtue, one with shared traditions and a strong sense of collective duty, is basically immune. It's a shield that protects the community from outsiders who supposedly want to profit from its collapse.
And then the author makes this just explicitly anti-Semitic and dehumanizing claim. He argues that when a community doesn't have virtue, it creates a vacuum that he alleges Jewish people exploit to divide communities for profit. He uses this really hateful and bigoted language to make his point.
Okay, so next up, we're going to look at how the author expands his conspiracy theory. He claims that modern globalism and even the education system were specifically designed to destroy this cultural defense he's been talking about. So here's the conspiracy theory, laid out step by step. First, he says merchants wanted to escape their duties to their king and their homeland. So second, they created these ideas of freedom and liberty to justify it. Third, he claims that Jewish people, who he says were historically nomadic, thrived in this new system. And finally, in a very common anti-Semitic trope, he claims that institutions like the Frankfurt School were created to basically indoctrinate Europeans with this so-called merchant ideology.
As part of his whole attack on modernity, the author singles out standardized, universal education. For him, this was a key tool used for what he sees as cultural erosion.
And to support this point, he brings up this data on language. He claims it shows a huge shift from regional dialects to dominant national languages right after universal education was introduced. He uses this to argue that unique local cultures were being deliberately erased.
And here's the author's conclusion on this point. He argues that this homogenization, combined with what he calls merchant ideology, basically destroyed Europeans' ability to tell different peoples apart. It left them atomized, like isolated individuals, and therefore vulnerable to groups that he sees as being more cohesive.
And this all leads us to the final section of the essay, the author's conclusion and his proposed solutions.
Now, this is an interesting move. The author tries to make his theory sound a little more credible by framing it not as some big, grand conspiracy, but as a more natural process of cultural decay that was just opportunistically exploited by a group he describes as being more cohesive than Europeans.
So what are his solutions? Well, they are rooted in a really reactionary and isolationist worldview. He suggests things like outlawing grass lawns, forcing people to grow their own food, pushing local markets and jobs, and even imposing some technology restrictions. The goal of all this is to create these really insular, homogeneous communities modeled after groups like the Amish, all in an attempt to rebuild his version of virtue.
When we analyze hateful texts like this one, it's not really about engaging with the questions they pretend to ask. The real takeaway here is understanding the anatomy of hate speech itself. You learn to see how it creates false choices, how it distorts history, and how it uses dehumanizing language to target a specific group. Recognizing those tactics, well, that is the first and most important step in being able to reject them completely.